folks, hope you all are doing well. I'm Karan Bandal from economies, and in this video, let's talk about the worrisome state of the global sovereign debt, or the state of the debts taken on by the governments globally. Almost every nation borrows money to finance its budget, some more than the others. As of 2023, the global debt stood at $97 trillion. It is a massive number. But we cannot look at this debt pile in isolation. Sovereign debt is often talked about in terms of the debt to GDP ratio. A country with a larger GDP can carry a larger debt load. So let's look at this debt in relation to the global GDP. As of 2023, the global GDP was over $100 trillion. That is, if you add the GDP of the United States, China, Japan, India, etc., all the nations put together, their cumulative GDP comes out at over $100 trillion. That means global debt to GDP ratio stood at a little over 90%. Now, the sustainable range for debt to GDP ratio, according to some experts, is between 40 and 60%. So, the current level of global debt is a concern. If you zoom into this global debt pile, we see that the United States, China, and Japan carry most of this global debt at over 60% of the total. Japan appears to be in a particularly precarious position. Its debt to GDP stood at over 250%. It is the worst performing nation on this list as far as its debt as a proportion of its GDP is concerned. Germany is the only country on this list with a reasonable debt level. India has the second lowest debt to GDP at a little over 80%, but India is a developing nation, unlike the other 9 countries on this list. Developing nations have an even lower threshold for sustainable debt at around 40 to 50% of the GDP. Bottom line, except for Germany, no country on this list of top economies is in good shape in terms of sovereign debt. This surge in global debt has seen an acceleration since 2019. It has risen by 40% since then. And COVID-19 pandemic was the main driver of this surge as the governments in the West introduced multiple stimulus spending plans to support the job market and prevent a wave of bankruptcies. In doing so, they ended up borrowing huge sums of money. These debts matter. They come with consequences. Nations like the United States, UK, and Japan are now carrying debt to GDP ratios of over 100%. I understand these are wealthy, stable, developed nations, so it's highly unlikely that they will default on their debts. But given this increasing debt load, the cost of servicing this debt or the interest payments on these debts will eat up more and more of the government resources every passing year. For example, in the United States, just the interest cost is over $1 trillion now, or over 20% of the total government's annual spending, more than even the defense spending. A rising level of debt without a commensurate rise in the GDP will mean these governments will be left with fewer dollars in the future for productive and social welfare spending. On the other end of the spectrum, there are these poorly managed economies. These nations have borrowed money from domestic lenders, other nations, and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. Now, the IMF was established in 1944 to help struggling nations by providing them with financial aid and guidance on policies to enhance economic stability. The IMF is the lender of last resort for any nation. So, as a nation, if you are going to the IMF to borrow money, you are in deep trouble. Look at the top 10 countries most in debt to the IMF. These nations are at a severe risk of economic distress due to the rising global debt. They already are suffering. See, Argentina has been bailed out by the IMF over 20 times in the last 6 decades. The nation saw an average annual inflation of almost 100% recently. Pakistan has had to go to the IMF for over 23 times since the creation of this nation for a bailout. They have recently borrowed an even larger amount from the IMF and have almost doubled their debt to the IMF. In 2023, Egypt faced steep borrowing costs with 40% of their revenues going towards debt repayments. In total, almost 100 countries owe money to the IMF. A grand total of these debts is over $100 billion, and the 10 countries on this list account for almost 70% of these debts. In summary, almost all the nations have seen their debts rise, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. This trend of rising global debt is not sustainable though. There will be consequences. Some nations will default on their debts, while others may suffer a prolonged period of tepid economic growth. Developed nations will still be fine, but developing nations need to be proactive if they wish to shield their citizens to some extent from the fallout of the potential debt crisis. I hope you found this analysis interesting. I'll speak with you again next week. Until then, take care.